Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Richard Powers' #1 best-selling novel, The Overstory, won the Pulitzer Prize and has more than 1 million copies in print. His new novel, Playground, captures the beauty and loss of the ocean, following 4 lives: a marine biologist, an artist, a schoolteacher, and an AI pioneer, as they intersect on an island in French Polynesia. Set in the world's largest ocean, Playground explores that last wild place we have yet to colonize in a still unfolding oceanic game, and interweaves beautiful writing, rich characterization, profound themes of technology and the environment, and a deep exploration of our shared humanity. Richard Powers is the author of 14 novels, including The Overstory, Bewilderment, and Orfeo. He is the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, the Pulitzer Prize, and the National Book Award. It is always a pleasure to welcome Richard Powers to the Book Show. Richard, thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Joe. I'm so glad to be back.
It's wonderful to have you back. You have been on for many of your novels, and it's always a great thrill for me to talk to you. And even more so, it's reading your work is such a pleasant and edifying experience. I'm curious as what brought you to the ocean, what brought you to wanting to explore this world. We'll get to how you do it in a moment, but just the overall subject I'm curious about.
My desire to write a book about the ocean probably started 57 years ago when my older sister gave me a book on coral reefs for my 10th birthday. I was growing up on the north side of Chicago in a little suburb called Lincolnwood, right on the northern border of Chicago. And I have no idea what prompted this gift from my sister Peg. I just remember devouring it, and especially being completely hypnotized by the photographs of these alien life forms in these psychedelic colors, in forms that shapes and configurations that I just could not wrap my head around. And I would be reading this book on the second story of our little suburban brick house, looking out the window on a street full of suburban brick houses, and then looking down at this book and thinking, what planet do I live on? And just never imagining that I would ever be able to get a glimpse of these otherworldly creatures. As it turned out, my father, school principal, took a job in Bangkok, Thailand, pulled up stakes, brought his family of 7 around the world. And the next year I was swimming, snorkeling in the South China Sea in these same reefs that had seemed so much an artifact of science fiction to me the year before. And from the age of 11 to the age of 16, I was absolutely convinced I was going to be an oceanographer or a marine biologist or something of that sort. I got sidetracked on fiction and spent 40 years writing books. So this is in a way a return to a childhood fascination, a childhood obsession.
It is fascinating because you look at both the technological and the digital concerns and moving back and forth between those. And I'm curious as to how then you create the cast of characters that allows you to do that with those narratives and ultimately examining the 4 lives.
Character creation is always fascinating to me because sometimes, individual people who end up in a book that I write at the age of 67 have antecedents throughout my whole life. One individual character might be a composite of 4 or 5 or more people who I've met over the years. Maybe even drawing on the vast space of psychic imagination, characters that you come across in other fictions. there's this odd dream logic of piecing psyches together in a meaningful and an evocative way. I would say, though, in this case, some of these characters are much closer to home and are much less a composite and much more derived from individuals. For instance, the character of Rafi, a black South Side kid who grows up in a kind of fortress of literature. It's a kind of rough home life, and he is a precocious reader, and he uses his ability to read as a kind of safe haven. That came very directly out of 30 years of stories that a dear friend of mine has told me, and who I worked with very closely when writing the book. So many of the details and much of the psychology of that character actually came from this long friendship of mine. The narrator of the book, Todd Keene, a North Side Chicago kid born into a more affluent family, who ends up devoting his life to programming. In some ways, Todd is a kind of alter ego for me. He's the road not taken. He's who I might have been had I made different choices at an earlier age. Those two characters are very much recreations of inner psychic personal experiences of mine and the experiences of a close friend. The two main characters, the two main women in the book, Ina Arawita, and a Polynesian artist who ends up growing up in military bases. She has an American father and ends up going to school with Todd and Rafi. She's a bit more of a composite of people who I knew when I was living in Bangkok, friends who had gone to high school with me then. And then also her vocational interest. I think her life as an artist grows out of sculptor friends of mine and the description of their work that I've lived with in fascination for many years.
So when you have that group, it is fascinating. And let me begin with Rafi, because this is a character, the friendship between Rafi and Todd is so well told and so incredibly developed. And we see even in the earliest moments that Rafi appears in the novel that there's an anger there, right? There's a deep anger that exists.
There's a push-pull between Rafi and Todd. They end up together at an elite high school, an actual high school on the south side of Chicago, who a couple family members of mine and couple of friends of mine actually attended. So that was nice to have an insider look at that school from different historical moments. But Rafi and Todd they bond over being outsiders in this high school, not entirely understood, kind of marginalized as a bit nerdish. They both have had very unhappy family histories and tough childhoods. So they bond over that as well. But because they're being drawn together as young men who are forming their self-identity around their ability to think and to be clever and quick, that creates a tension in their friendship. It turns competitive. So the very thing that draws them together, their love of games, their love of competing, also puts them over the years in more precarious situations with regard to each other. While they're growing and they're scaring each other into acts of growth, they're also combating each other. And the friendship is never devoid of this sense of one-upsmanship and who can best the other at the latest game.
Richard Powers is the author of the new book Playground, and it is published by Norton. When you have those characters like that, and as you say, there's that push pull, Do you ever have a stake in the sense of taking sides, or do you look for a neutrality of letting them duke it out?
Well, I guess classically, the goal of the novelist is to render complex all kinds of emotional conflicts and moral conflicts, dramatic conflicts, and not to reduce them by stacking the deck, but to make both positions sympathetic and to allow them to be robust and to allow readers to have a sympathetic attachment and identification to both ends of those conflicts. I think in this book, it was particularly interesting for me to try to do that because both Todd and Rafi are in some interesting ways very easy for me to identify with. For instance, Rafi's decision to try to make a go of it as a student of literature, as a poet, as an academic, as someone who devotes himself to uh, literary pursuits. Uh, that was very much my decision as a young man to kind of turn my back on my math and science abilities, my ability to program computers, and to instead pursue a life of writing novels. On the other hand, Todd is just as much a kind of alter ego because everything that he ends up doing was something that I was on the brink of committing myself to when I was younger. So in an interesting way, not resolving from the outside all the tensions between two people who have very different ways of looking at the world, also permitted me as a creator to do a kind of vicarious psychoanalysis, kind of uh, um, imaginative exploration of the tensions inside myself, the two different ways that I have of looking at the world. And Keats had this great famous line about Shakespeare that he was capable of a negative capability of holding all kinds of contradictions and paradoxes in his head without the need to resolve them. And I've always thought of that as a powerful uh, artistic position. And in particular, in this book, I wanted to have negative capability with regard to the friendship of Rafi and Todd, which goes very bad. I mean, there's a real breach between them, and a great kind of reckoning of all the things that they've swept under the rug for years, that they've danced around. And when the painful break finally comes, it was especially challenging for me as an artist to say, do not decide who the guilty party in this breach is. Simply try to evoke as richly as possible the way that it looks to each of these injured parties and make them both sympathetic.
Is the goal or a hope that you have that people will read it different ways?
Oh, that's beyond hope. I mean, it's a given. It's taken me many, many, many years to realize that the reception of a novel is always a kind of statistical distribution curve. You can't control the stories that people are bringing to your story.
Right.
You could read the thing and it's the same with books that you yourself read. When you haven't written them, I can read a book, be deeply moved by it, and be reduced to tears, and consider it one of the most profound artistic experiences that I've ever had. I can give it to a person that I love, and they could be left cold by it.
Mm.
And you want to say you read that wrong, but they didn't. They just simply read it from the context of their own lives at the moment that they read it and under the circumstances of their consumption. And there's no gainsaying that. I want to believe in some outside objective quality or reality to art, and to say this book will move everyone, but there is no such book. And in fact, we all know when we've read books at different times, the same book at different times in our own life. It only a couple of years apart, you can read the book and say, oh, I missed everything.
Mm. when you look at the subjects that you go into here, and I would like to go for a moment to Makatea, this island strip mine for phosphate until about the 1960s, and then abandoned until this group proposes reindustrializing it and to do something they refer to as seasteading. Give us an idea of that and what is afoot here.
So I first came across seasteading a couple of years ago. There was a terrific book-length treatment of it and its possibilities and its perils, and it involves the basic idea is the creation of floating towns, modular floating platforms that have living quarters, but also work quarters, possible aquaculture quarters. But the idea is that there would be this push to assemble these structures and float them out into international waters where they would be under the governance of no state. They would be able to evade regulations, and they would provide the possibility of new forms of government, new possible ways of human industry and doing business. And what fascinated me about the more I read about this is how polarizing it is. And there are the techno-utopians who see this as the logical next step in human culture and industry, and there are, of course, the deep skeptics who see this as another Silicon Valley libertarian fantasy. To me, what was fascinating about it was its function as a kind of microcosm for the way that we treat the earth as a whole. What is the relationship between the human project and the project, the rest of the more than human world? And to set this out as a possibility for this tiny island in French Polynesia, it's half the size of Manhattan. It had at one time in the early 20th century several thousand people extracting phosphate, basically consuming the island and exporting it abroad to be used as agricultural fertilizer. So this tiny little island, making it possible for the rest of the world to have these geometric population growth patterns, and then left abandoned, half eaten out, despoiled, to be presented with this new option, and to have the very, very few people who have remained on this island, about 80 people, have to look at this proposal and decide whether or not it is their way forward, whether this could finally be a way of making sustainable livings on this tiny island that has no other industry, whether it might be their way to build a hospital, secure their schools, allow their children to remain on the island, bring in new people, or whether it's just another form of colonialism. It just seemed to me that seasteading was the perfect kind of double-edged sword that could be dangled in front of these people. And of course, in their decision, these islanders on Makatea are themselves kind of a microcosm of the decisions that we are all facing with regard to what we believe is the proper way to move forward in this world. It was a great shock to me and a great confirmation to me as I read deeper to discover that Silicon Valley CEOs and multi-millionaires actually did at one point create a kind of letter of intent with regard to seasteading in French Polynesia. To my knowledge, that project is now pretty much on hold, not moving forward. But to have this idea and then to see that, in fact, there was a real world basis for it was a real confirmation for me.
Richard Powers is our guest. The new novel is Playground, and it is published by W. Norton and Company. You talk about coming to the oceans after 56 years, that it's almost inevitable that you would write about oceans?
I see this as the third part of kind of a 3-book suite of my exploring this idea of human exceptionalism. This began in The Overstory, and I continue it in Bewilderment, my last two novels. And I continue to ask that question in the broadest way that I knew how in this new novel. How is it that we've come about to think of ourselves as something radically separate from all the rest of the living planet? How is it that the story that we tell ourselves is of absolute human centrality, where the rest of creation is basically here as a set of resources for us, and not the other way around, not the way that the story of human beings has been understood by most people in most parts of the world for most of human history, which is to say that humans are only a very small part of a massively larger and interconnected story. And what I've been trying to do is use the novel, which actually has been pretty committed to human exceptionalism. The literary novel has been somewhat committed to human exceptionalism for some time, to take that form and to try to spin new kinds of stories that reconnect us and reveal our interdependence and basically try to elicit in the mind of a reader this almost religious sense of being part of a vastly larger story. Now, when you think about the planet Earth, if we had to describe this place to aliens, the reality is, that 71% of the surface of the Earth is water. The water is on average, 2 miles or more deep. It's filled with life from top to bottom. This is relatively new discoveries and appreciations that we've had about just how dense the oceans are with living things. If you do the math, it then, it turns out that 99% of the available living space for large creatures on Earth is underwater. We're just a kind of sideshow in that. When you think about it on the time frame of evolution, life was actually evolving for billions of years before it came up on land. Again, we're just a very small latecomer to this story of life on Earth. How can we connect the human story to the fullest possible story of life on Earth? For that, we have to go into the oceans.
Todd is dealing with Rafi and is telling us aspects of his story. He is also gravely ill, and the idea of that, looking at his illness, at what he is dealing with, and how that motivates the character to ultimately do what he does.
Yeah. So Todd is telling the story from relatively late in his own life. And he, as you say, has just been diagnosed, in this case, with Lewy body dementia. Right. So part of his desire to tell the story, to get it down, is his knowledge that the story is going to disappear very quickly. And he tells the story in the first person. And classically in literature, we know about first-person narrators. We know that their unreliability is always, to some extent, self-incriminating. When Nick tells us, let me tell you about my friend Jay Gatsby, he's really revealing things about himself that we may end up seeing better than he does because of his desire to tell us this other story. Now, I think that Todd is almost a doubly unreliable first-person narrator. He's saying, let me tell you about my friend Rafi and what went wrong. And of course, the reader is saying, wait, but you're telling the story. We never actually get to hear what Rafi thinks went wrong. It's always through your eyes. So there's that degree of unreliability. But now we have overlaid on top of that the Lewy body dementia, where he is becoming unreliable even to himself. His ability to hold on to make sense of, and to make coherent his own story is slowly being lost. And so that's the pathos of his narratorial position, that we are going to learn all kinds of things about himself that he may or may not want to be revealing. And we're going to do that. We're going to see that even as he begins to lose his own sense of who he is.
As you finish a novel like this, how long does it stay with you, and what it is like to let it go?
It's really interesting, Joe. I would say, in all honesty, that this book was the closest thing that I've ever had to a gift. I had a couple of false starts, and then once I was underway, it was almost like it was dropping down on me, and I just had to take dictation. And that I've never had that experience to the extent that I've had it in this book. The book is about play. It's about the dark side of play and the light side of play, and the way in which play underwrites not just human culture and individuals, but also evolution at large. But it was also an act of play for me to make. And, I kept thinking about that, the convergence of recreation. I told you that earlier that this book is in many ways a recreation of my childhood desire to become an oceanographer, but it was also a recreation. It was just something I looked forward to sitting down to every day, watching unfold, almost like a game of Go between my two protagonists, just to watch the moves be added one by one and see the patterns and take joy in them. So it was a delightful book to write, and therefore a harder book to leave. And it's, in a strange way, although I'm very pleased with the way that the stories came together, I was kind of shocked to discover the ways that they were going to come together as I was working. It's also been I've been more anxious about this one in some ways, watching it go into the world and wondering how it's going to be received.
The name of the new novel is Playground by Richard Powers. It is published by Norton. Richard, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I can't thank you enough for being with us. A great honor, and I thank you so much.
Oh, this was great fun. Thanks again for having me. I appreciate it.
Again, Richard Powers' new novel is Playground. It is published by Norton. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on national productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.